They gave me a laminated badge that said, Guest. Not last year, not the year before. This year, at the Hale Systems annual Innovation Gala, held in the grand ballroom of the Chicago Marquette Hotel, 11 years after I first walked through their glass doors, as a 25-year-old kid with a laptop bag and a portfolio that had more confidence than polish. This year, they put my name on a lanyard in 12-point font and pointed me toward the folding chairs lined up against the side wall. Guest. My name is Ryan Cole. I'm 36 years old. I live in Chicago, in a Lincoln Park townhouse, with high ceilings and a wife's decorator choices on every surface. I am, or was, a cybersecurity architect of some standing, the kind of man who doesn't make the headlines, but keeps the people who make headlines from losing everything to a bad actor with a stolen credential and 30 seconds of dwell time. I am the kind of man who builds things in the dark so other men can shine in the light. I should have understood that sentence earlier than I did. I kept my face completely neutral the whole drive over. Jaw loose, shoulders back, the practiced stillness of a man who has spent a decade learning to hold himself perfectly still while things boil underneath the surface. My wife Diane sat in the passenger seat, phone already out. Already somewhere else. Already working through the social calculus of who she needed to speak to first when we arrived. She smelled like jasmine and something slightly off the way expensive rooms smell when someone has sprayed air freshener over something they don't want you to notice. You look tired, she said without lifting her eyes from the screen. I'm fine. Don't do the quiet thing tonight, okay? This is a big night for Dad. He needs everyone to be on. I didn't answer. I watched the Chicago skyline passing through the rain-slicked passenger window, the city blurred and amber and white, the way it always looked from inside a moving car, beautiful. Because you were passing through it and not having to be part of it. I watched it, and I felt the first thing. Not a crack, not a break, just a slow bend somewhere deep in my center, like load-bearing steel under pressure that has been accumulating for longer than the building was designed to hold. I breathed through it and kept driving. The ballroom was everything it always was. Suits worth more than some people's car payments. Women draped in jewelry that could fund a medical startup. Champagne ferried on silver trays by people who understood with their entire bodies what it felt like not to be invited to events like this. A string quartet in the corner playing something classical and slightly too quiet to actually hear. The whole elaborate theater of money performing itself for an audience of money. Victor Hale stood at the center of it. He always did. 62 years old, silver-haired, barrel-chested, with the kind of grip in his handshake that announced, each time, that he'd spent 40 years making sure the last thing you remembered about meeting him was his hand closing around yours. He'd built Hale Systems from a mid-sized regional IT consultancy into something people in this city actually talked about at the right dinners. He said so himself, constantly. It had become part of his mythology, and he maintained the mythology the way serious men maintain it through repetition, through selective memory, and through keeping the real builders carefully out of frame. His son Marcus flanked him 2 steps to the right, sharper suit, colder eyes, the particular hunger of a man who has been handed a path and resents that the handing of it didn't also come with the feeling of having earned it. Marcus had never liked me. I'd always known it without being able to prove it, the way you know certain things by the temperature that drops, very slightly, when you walk into a room. And there, standing near the main stage with his arms folded and a look of quiet, rehearsed triumph on his face, was Derek Walsh, my colleague, my partner on the most critical technical project Hale had ever undertaken, the man I'd spent 18 months in the trenches with, arguing design decisions at 2 in the morning over bad Thai food and cold coffee, the man I'd trusted with my frameworks, my architecture diagrams, my source documentation, my thinking, because that's what you do with a partner. You share the work. You trust that shared work means shared credit. Derek Walsh. Tonight wearing the title Chief Innovation Officer on his badge in full text with no abbreviation. His chest was out. His shoulders were back. He had the posture of a man who has just been handed something that fits and is trying to make his body believe it was always his. The presentation screen behind the stage rose with a soft hydraulic hum. It filled with the SHIELDWALL logo, the proprietary threat detection architecture I had conceived, designed from first principles, and built prototype by prototype over 18 months, following the breach that had nearly destroyed this company. The logo was clean, professional, exactly as I'd sketched it, at 11:30 one night, when Victor was too scared to sleep and I was too stubborn to stop. I remembered the marker in my hand. I remembered the smell of the whiteboard. I remembered the feeling of something clicking into place in my mind that I knew, with the bone-deep certainty of genuine discovery, was right. The caption beneath the logo read, SHIELDWALL, architected by Derek Walsh, Chief Innovation Officer, Hale Systems. My name was not on the screen, not at the bottom, not in acknowledgement, not in the footnotes, not anywhere in the room. I stood very still and let that land. I thought about the patent filings, how they had been quietly amended 6 months back, the kind of administrative shuffle that happens at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday and gets filed and archived and nobody is expected to notice. How my name had migrated in those filings from lead inventor to contributing engineer. How I had caught it in an email thread I wasn't supposed to see, flagged it to Diane, and she had tilted her head with the slight irritation she reserved for conversations she'd already decided weren't worth having. Does it really matter whose name is on it if everyone's getting paid? I had told myself it was a clerical error. I was very, very good at telling myself things. The applause in the room swelled as Derek moved to the microphone and began speaking in the smooth, unhurried cadence of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times, who had prepared for every question, who was wearing stolen credit the way you wear something that's been tailored to fit because you've had it long enough to let it get warm against your body. 3 years ago, Derek said, this company faced an existential threat. What you see tonight is what it looks like when a team refuses to accept failure. A team. I pressed the back of my head very gently against the wall behind me, closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds, breathed through my nose, counted. Then I opened them and set my mineral water down on the bar without a word, and I walked, slowly and deliberately, to an empty stretch of wall near the back emergency exit where I stood alone and let the room blur in front of me into sound and light. I thought about what 3 years had actually looked like. The server room at 2 a.m. with coffee rings on every surface and red circles on every whiteboard. The federal auditors who'd wanted to pull the contract before I sat across from them for 6 hours and convinced them to give us 60 more days. The blueprint I'd written on my own laptop, in my own apartment, over one brutal February weekend, when the temperature dropped to -15 and the wind came off the lake like a wall, and I hadn't been able to sleep and hadn't wanted to because there was still something I hadn't solved yet, and I couldn't stop until I solved it. The code reviews, the architecture sessions, the threat modeling, the 18-month grind of building something from nothing under the kind of pressure that either breaks you or burns off everything that isn't essential and leaves only what's real. That team. Diane appeared at my side 40 minutes later, materializing from the crowd with 2 champagne flutes and the specific social smile I had learned, slowly and painfully, to read correctly. That smile was a performance notification. It meant people were watching. It meant the gap between the version of us that existed and the version she needed people to see had to be closed immediately. There you are. She pressed a glass into my hand. Why are you all the way over here? Getting some air. Dad's doing the toast soon. Come on. She tugged my sleeve, already half turning. I didn't move. I looked at her. Really. Looked at her. And I felt the bend deepen. That slow, structural failure. The kind that happens quietly, invisibly, from the inside, until the outside can no longer hold its shape. Ryan. A warning, wrapped in silk. I put the champagne down on the window ledge untouched, and I followed her back into the light. I smiled when I was supposed to. I raised my glass when Victor gave his toast about vision and leadership, and the courage to times bet on the right people. I did all of it correctly. I felt none of it, but somewhere underneath that practiced stillness, something had started counting. The drive home was quiet. Diane was on her phone before we'd even cleared the hotel driveway, heels still on, already composing herself for whatever came next. I drove, and I let the city move around me, and I let myself go back, not to punish myself, to understand how I'd ended up standing in that ballroom feeling like a stranger in a story I'd written. I grew up in Rockford, Illinois. My father drove freight, long routes, the kind of work that took him away Monday through Friday and brought him back on weekends already tired. My mother taught second grade and ran the house with the precision of someone who had learned very young that chaos was expensive and that prevention was worth all the effort that cure was not. We weren't poor, exactly, but we operated in the register of careful the register where every decision has a second layer of math underneath it. Can we afford this? What does it cost if we can't? What I got from that upbringing wasn't resentment. It was attention. I noticed things. I noticed systems and how they failed. I noticed the gap between what people said and what the underlying structure actually supported. I noticed pressure points. I noticed what held. By 23, I had a computer science degree from a state school and a reputation in certain security forums that didn't match my age. At 22, I'd found a critical vulnerability in a major banking platform, reported it responsibly through proper channels, and received a handwritten thank you note and a $500 gift card. I remember holding the card and thinking, that's what they think I'm worth. I remember being neither surprised nor defeated by it. I remember thinking, wait, I came to Hale Systems at 25 on a consulting arrangement that was supposed to last 6 months. It lasted 11 years because of Diane. I met her at a company mixer 8 weeks into the contract. She was across the room when I arrived, deep in a conversation with someone I didn't recognize, and she had the posture of a woman who was very rarely bored, but was mildly bored right now, and managing it gracefully. She broke off that conversation and looked at me across the room and said, when I made my way over, "You're the consultant everyone's terrified of, aren't you?" Not a question. A read. I told her I wasn't trying to be terrifying. She said, "That makes it worse." I was gone. Immediately and completely gone. The way you go when something meets you at exactly the right frequency. When the intelligence of another person reorganizes the room, what I didn't fully absorb until much later, what I let myself not absorb was how much of that moment lived inside a larger architecture. Victor Hale's architecture. A family that treated relationships the way experienced operators treated acquisitions. You identify the asset, you bring it inside the structure, you leverage it while it's productive, and you make sure it never has enough autonomy to exit on its own terms. Not consciously, maybe, not with malice aforethought. It was simpler than malice. It was just how they operated. It was the only system they knew. Victor had shaken my hand at a company dinner 6 months after Diane and I started seeing each other. He'd looked at me with the assessing eyes of a man who is checking whether a piece of equipment meets spec. Then he'd said, "We could use someone like you." Not a compliment. An evaluation. The kind of thing you say about a tool that does what you need it to do. I didn't care at the time. I was 30 years old, and I believed. With the complete sincere belief of a working-class kid who has been making something from nothing his entire life, that merit was a language that power eventually had to learn to speak. That if you showed up reliably enough, delivered excellently enough, proved your value past every reasonable benchmark, the attitude would change. That helping out would eventually become something that acknowledged what was actually being built. That's the thing about that kind of belief. It isn't naive. It's not stupidity. It's the faith that drove everything you've ever done. The engine that got you out of Rockford and into a room full of people whose names were on things. And because that faith has served you before, because it's gotten you through every hard thing you've ever done, you extend it to situations where it has no business being extended. You give it to people who see your faith as a resource to extract. Diane and I married 2 years after the mixer. The wedding was in Lake Geneva. Late September. The trees just beginning to turn. The water flat and silver. Victor paid for it. Every detail. With the decisive generosity of a man who understood that paying for things made them his. I took that as acceptance. I understand now that it was leverage, a transaction that bound me to the family's accounting in a way I couldn't name or see clearly. Marcus gave a toast that mentioned me exactly once, calling me the tech guy keeping Dad's systems safe with a grin that generously implied it was a compliment. Diane laughed. I laughed. The room laughed. I remember catching my own reflection in the window behind the wedding party and thinking I looked happy. I was happy, or something close enough to it that I didn't notice the difference. The first year of the marriage, everything was fine in the way things are fine when you're moving too fast to look carefully. The townhouse, the rhythms we built, the shared life that felt complete when you were inside it, and only looked precarious from outside. I worked. I delivered. I came home. We went to Victor's in Evanston for Sunday dinners, where I sat at the far end of the table and passed things, and answered when I was asked direct questions, and otherwise occupied the chair without occupying the conversation. I remember once, about 18 months in, sitting at that table and watching Victor hold court about a decision he'd made on a vendor contract. A contract I had, in fact, renegotiated 3 months earlier. He described the decision as his own, not lying exactly, just inhabiting the outcome without the history, the way people do when the history belongs to someone they've already classified as help. I looked at Diane when he said it, a quick involuntary look. She was nodding, fork halfway to her mouth, entirely comfortable. That was the first time I noticed the discomfort had somewhere to go if I let it. That there was a version of this moment where I said something, where I named what had happened, where I took up the space in that conversation that was factually mine. And I noticed that the reason I didn't was not politeness. The reason I didn't was because I had already, without quite deciding to, absorbed the operating principle of this family. That the help didn't interrupt the story. The help just made the story possible. I picked up my fork and kept eating. I told myself it was a culture thing. Old school. They showed appreciation differently. I told myself a lot of things. What I understand now is that there's a particular kind of erosion that happens in small, almost undetectable increments. No single event is the thing that changes you. It's the accumulation. Every dinner where you're the footnote. Every meeting where your idea becomes someone else's sentence. Every morning where you wake up next to someone who was briefed on your inner world by a man who shouldn't have had access to it. The erosion is so gradual that your sense of your own size adjusts without your awareness. The way your eyes adjust to a darkening room. You don't notice it getting dark. You notice, suddenly, that you can barely see. I sat with it the whole drive home from the gala that night, turning it over. 11 years of those small moments, those micro-corrections, those quiet reductions, and I'd absorbed every single one of them, reframed each one, filed them under times that's just how they are. Times and times they show things differently, times and times it doesn't matter. The work matters, until the night it mattered too much to file away anymore. The collapse came in March, 3 years ago. I remember exactly where I was when the call came in. Running, 6:15 in the morning, 4 miles into a lakeshore route. The sun just beginning to break over Michigan, in long, flat bands of light that turned the water copper. I was in the zone that clean. Effortless zone where your body runs itself and your mind goes quiet when my phone lit up with Victor's number. Victor Hale almost never called me. That alone told me everything I needed to know before I even answered. "We have a problem," he said. "How bad?" 3 seconds of silence. Victor Hale did not do silence. He did not pause. He did not hesitate. He did not leave spaces unfilled. The silence told me to run back. I turned on my heel mid-stride and ran back. A state-sponsored threat actor, we identified them later as a group operating out of Eastern Europe with documented ties to industrial espionage, had been sitting quietly inside Hale's network for 61 days. Before a routine, anomaly check tripped an alert. Nobody was watching closely enough. 61 days. By the time the alarm registered, they had accessed vendor contract archives, client data repositories, and a preliminary draft of the federal proposal that represented 18 months of business development work and the company's entire growth strategy for the next 5 years. The call I got from Victor at 6:15 in the morning was the call after the call. After the security team had already made the first terrible assessment and understood that the problem was too big for what they had. After Victor had sat with that knowledge for exactly long enough to decide, he needed someone who could fix it, not just someone who could explain why it couldn't be fixed. I drove to the office still in my running clothes. I didn't go home first. There wasn't time, and I knew it. What followed was the worst 7 months of my professional life, and paradoxically, the most alive I have ever felt. That's the contradiction nobody tells you about genuine crisis work. The clarity is intoxicating. When the stakes are real, when something is actually on the line. Not performance on the line, but time's everything. On the line, all the noise burns away. What you're left with is pure signal. The problem, the solution, the distance between them. Get to work. I built SHIELDWALL from the ground up over those 7 months. The core anomaly detection model, which learned behavioral baselines across every network segment and flagged deviations with a precision the existing systems couldn't approach. The layered authentication schema, which added non-bypassable verification at every critical access point without degrading system performance enough to interfere with operations. The threat classification engine, which categorized and prioritized alerts in real time, so the team was responding to the most critical events first, instead of drowning in a waterfall of equal priority noise. The incident response protocol that made the whole system actionable, instead of just observational. All of it came from my head, my hands, my hours. I remember specific nights with a clarity that time hasn't softened. A Tuesday in April when I was in the server room at 11 p.m., and found an elegant solution to the latency problem that had been defeating me for 3 weeks, and the surge of something that wasn't quite joy. Joy was too light, a word more like the satisfaction of a bone setting correctly after being out of place for too long. I sat on the server room floor for 15 minutes, just feeling that. Then, I got back up and kept going. I remember a phone call at 2 in the morning with an external security researcher I'd tracked down through his published papers, convincing him in 30 minutes to give me a weekend of his time to stress test the detection model before deployment. He didn't owe me anything. He helped because the problem was interesting, and because I'd explained it correctly. That's the kind of credibility you build by doing the work right. People who don't know you can read you in the first conversation. Derek ran component testing and managed integration timelines. He was good at it. Meticulous. I didn't give him more than he could handle, and he delivered everything I gave him. But the architecture, the original, core, load-bearing structure of the whole system was mine, down to the fundamental logic of how the layers talk to each other. I also did everything that wasn't building the system. I negotiated with the Federal Contracting Office to extend our deadline by 60 days, sitting across from 2 procurement officers who had every reason to pull the contract and walking them through, hour by patient hour, exactly what we were building and why it was worth their patience. I sat with Hale's liability insurer for 6 hours, explaining technical specifics in plain language until they agreed to hold their position. I renegotiated 3 vendor agreements that were 48 hours from termination. I worked 7-day weeks for 4 of those 7 months. I ran on 4 hours of sleep and the particular focused cold that shows up when the cost of failing is too real to ignore. Victor came to the office twice during those months. Both times he stood in the doorway of the war room, the conference room we'd converted into our working space. Every wall covered in my handwriting, and looked at the boards and said variations of times, "Keep at it." That was it. No questions about what the work cost. No conversation about compensation or acknowledgement or what would come after. Just times, keep at it. The way you say it to someone whose job it is to keep at it. The night we crossed the finish line, the night the federal contract was formally re-awarded and the breach officially declared contained, I drove home at midnight with my hands not quite steady on the wheel. Not from fear, from the release of something that had been held under tremendous pressure for a very long time, finally being allowed to decompress. Like a fist, unclenching after hours of being held closed around something. Diane was on the couch when I got home. Laptop open, wine glass half empty, the television on low. She looked up when I came through the door. In her eyes, the mild, affectionate attention of a woman whose husband has come home from a long day of work. "How'd it go?" she said. "It's done," I said. "We got it." "Good." She looked back at her screen. "There's pasta in the fridge if you're hungry." I stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment, looking at the pot on the stove, and I felt something that I couldn't name precisely and didn't try to. Something quietly, fundamentally wrong about the shape of this moment. Something that told me the distance between what I had just done and what this homecoming reflected was not a distance I could keep pretending not to see. But I put the pasta in the microwave. I sat alone at the kitchen island. I ate. 2 weeks later, at the internal celebration dinner, Victor raised his glass and said, "This company survived because good people made the right calls." He looked around the table as he said it. His eyes moved past me, the way eyes move past furniture, recognizing the presence, not registering the significance. Marcus said, "Derek, good work on the technical side." Derek said, "Thank you." I drank my water. That was the night I started paying attention to things I had been choosing not to see. The gala was on a Thursday. I went back to it in my head the whole drive home, mentally replaying it the way you replay a collision, looking for where you could have moved differently, knowing you couldn't have moved differently, looking anyway. The laminated badge. The slide. Derek at the microphone. The specific quality of applause in that room. Warm and certain. The kind reserved for men who belong in the center of things. Diane was quiet the whole drive. Not her usual phone-occupied quiet. A tighter kind. The quality of silence that belongs to someone who is running a calculation in their head and doesn't want the process visible. I parked in the garage and let us in through the side entrance. Diane went straight upstairs, heels in hand, already reaching for her phone with the other. I went to the kitchen, poured water, stood at the counter in the dark for a while. The kind of still that comes after a long day when your body is tired and your mind is still accelerating. I was about to head upstairs when I heard the voices from the study. Not the television. Voices, 2 of them. Low, comfortable. The particular looseness of people who believe they're alone. I set my water glass down without a sound. The kind of soundless you get when every muscle in your body is paying attention. Marcus's voice first. He had no reaction at the gala. Nothing. Just that neutral face. Pause. Diane. He's always like that. He internalizes everything. By the time he actually does something about it, if he ever does, it'll be too late. Marcus. He saw the slide, though. Diane. He had to have seen it. Marcus. And the patent amendments? You said he noticed something a few months ago. Diane. I redirected it. Told him it was a clerical issue. He accepted it. Marcus let out a short sound. Not quite a laugh. More like the sound of a man confirming something he already knew. Of course he did. That's what makes him manageable. He accepts things. I did not move. I stood in the hallway, with my back against the wall and the dark around me, and my pulse doing something very slow and very measured in my chest, like a second hand that has decided to take its time. My hands were loose at my sides. My jaw was unclenched. I was breathing, slowly and deliberately, through my nose, manageable, Diane again. The full IP transfer has to go through before he retains outside counsel and understands what it actually means. Dad has the filing set for Tuesday. Walsh covers everything on paper. Walsh is lead on every patent as of 6 months ago. Ryan's listed as a contributing engineer. By the time anyone examines the ownership structure, it'll be legally locked. There it was. Not between the lines, not suggested or implied, said out loud. In my own home, in the study where I kept my certifications on the wall and my books on the shelves, said with the casual precision of people who have had this conversation before and are reviewing the plan rather than making it. And the situation with Walsh? Marcus said. A longer silence. Diane. That's separate. Is it? Don't. Marcus. I'm just saying, if Ryan figures out that the guy whose name is on all his work is also, he won't figure it out. The edge in her voice was the one I recognized from arguments I'd thought we were having about logistics, and had actually been having about something else entirely. He trusts too easily. Always has. It's his fundamental problem. His fundamental problem. I stood in that hallway with my back against the wall, and I let every word settle into me completely, without resistance, without the reflex to reframe or soften or explain away. I let it be exactly what it was. Derek Walsh. I ran it back through memory. The dinners I'd invited Derek to, because I'd wanted to build team culture. How Diane's phone had started facing down on the table around the same time. How she'd begun sleeping with a deliberate stillness that I now understood meant she was awake and didn't want me to know it. How Derek had started knowing things about my thinking small things. Inflections in how I described problems that he shouldn't have known unless someone who knew me very well had described them to him. How Diane had stopped asking about my work. How she had started knowing things about Hale's internal strategy before I mentioned them. I turned and walked back through the kitchen, out the side door, into the garage. Got into my car. Backed out. Drove. I drove for a long time. No music. No destination. Just the city moving around me in the dark. The rain beginning again on the windshield. The wipers keeping their steady time. My hands on the wheel were completely still. The way hands are when the body understands that falling apart is not currently an option. I thought about Tuesday. About a filing that would lock me permanently out of 11 years of my own work. Today was Thursday. I had 5 days. I pulled into a parking lot near the river and sat there with the engine running, watching the water move under the bridge lights, black and constant and indifferent to everything happening on either side of it. And I felt the thing that I hadn't expected to feel, which wasn't rage and wasn't grief. It was something closer to clarity. The specific clarity that comes when the last comfortable lie you've been telling yourself finally stops being livable. I thought about the version of myself I'd been watching in that hallway. Standing in the dark with grocery bags in his hands, listening to his own erasure described in his own home by his own wife. I thought about how long that version of me had been standing in hallways, figuratively, listening to arrangements that didn't include him, and accepting those arrangements without making himself known. 11 years of that. Not because I lacked self-respect I had always known, somewhere below the surface, what I was worth. But because I'd been willing to defer it, to bank it, to trust that eventually, the ledger would balance. The ledger would not balance. That was what Thursday night had clarified, with the unambiguous precision of a legal document. The ledger was not the point. The arrangement was not designed to produce a balanced ledger. The arrangement was designed to produce a ledger that read however Victor needed it to read, and I had been the mechanism by which that happened. That was over. I found a contact in my phone I hadn't called in 2 years. Connor Webb. IP. Attorney. A man who had once told me, over bad beer at a Cubs game, "If you ever need someone to go to war for you, call me first." I had laughed at the time. I hadn't thought I'd need it. I called him at midnight. He picked up on the third ring. "Ryan, it's midnight." "I know. I'm sorry. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" A pause. He heard something in my voice that I hadn't deliberately placed there but must have been audible. "Where?" "Somewhere quiet. My office. 8 o'clock. "I'll be there." I hung up and sat with the river for another few minutes. Then, I drove to the office. The Hale Systems building was quiet at 1:30 in the morning. Phil at the front security desk 60s. Deliberate. A man who had been watching this lobby since before I arrived, and who recognized me with the incurious familiarity of someone recognizing a piece of recurring scenery, waved me through without looking up from his phone. I rode the elevator to the 4th floor, the engineering wing. My old space, back when I still had a desk here, before I'd been gradually migrated to a smaller office on 2, then to a shared workspace that changed depending on the week, then to effectively nowhere a calendar of meetings with no fixed location, a man whose presence was needed but whose belonging was not established. That migration had happened so incrementally that I hadn't tracked it happening. The way water changes the shape of stone, too slow to watch, unmistakable in result. My access badge still worked on the server room door. They hadn't revoked it. Why would they? I was manageable. I accepted things. I sat at a terminal I knew better than my own kitchen, pulled my encrypted drive from my coat pocket, and I started. The patent trail first. The amendments were there, time-stamped, filed under an entity I'd never encountered. Hale IP. Holdings LLC. Created 14 months ago. Victor Hale. Managing member. Marcus Hale. Secondary signatory. Derek Walsh, listed as an outside consultant who had provided technical expertise and original architectural documentation in support of the filings. Original architectural documentation. I breathed through it. I needed to be cold, not angry. Cold had uses that anger did not. I went to the backup archive, the one I'd built myself during the breach response, because I was meticulous about backup architecture, and because nobody had thought to change my recursive access permissions afterward. Why would they? The help didn't revoke its own access. I found the original design files exactly where I'd left them. Architecture diagrams from month 1 of the SHIELDWALL project, with my handwritten notations scanned and uploaded. Time-stamped commit history from the development repository under my login credentials. Email threads in which I'd walked the team through every core design decision, explaining my reasoning, fielding questions, making calls that shaped the final system. Early whiteboard photographs I'd uploaded to the project drive because I documented everything not for self-protection, just because I was the kind of person who believed that good work should be provable, that the record of how something was built was part of what it was. Every layer of the original architecture bore my digital fingerprint. The creation timestamps, the commit logs, the design review notes from the external security auditors we'd brought in at month 14, who had specifically praised the elegant precision of the core detection model in a written report addressed, by name, to me. I copied everything to the encrypted drive. 3 hours of work, methodical and quiet. Then I kept going. The financial structures were messier, but legible once you understood the topology. Revenue from the federal contracts. Contracts my work had secured flowing through the company's standard accounts, then split. A portion rerouted through Hale IP Holdings as innovation licensing revenue, then out again to personal investment accounts registered to Victor and Marcus. A parallel consulting arrangement, listed as a legitimate business expense, that redirected additional contract revenue to an entity whose registered agent, when I tracked it back through public records, shared an address with Victor Hale's personal holding company. It wasn't sophisticated. It was the fraud of people who believed they would never be looked at. The kind that works for years because it's hidden inside success, and nobody examines the interior of something that's functioning correctly from the outside. I was going to make them look at it. Around 5:30, the city outside the windows began its shift from black to deep blue. That honest pre-dawn blue that arrives before the day starts performing itself. I closed the terminal, pocketed the drive, let myself back out of the server room and down the elevator and past Phil, who still didn't look up. I walked 2 blocks to a plaza bench and sat until the sun broke the horizon. Then, I drove to meet Connor. Connor Webb's office was in the loop. Clean, functional, with none of the decorative weight of firms that use their furniture to announce their own importance. He was behind his desk when I arrived, French press on the corner, reading glasses on his head where he'd already forgotten them. He poured coffee, sat across from me, and listened without interrupting while I laid out the entirety of what I knew. 11 minutes. I had organized it in my head during the drive. The patent amendments and the timeline. The Hale IP holding structure. The financial routing, the overheard conversation, and the Tuesday deadline. Derek Walsh and the nature of his access to information he shouldn't have had. All of it. In order. Without editorializing. When I finished, Connor was quiet. He had good silence, the kind that was working, not empty. "You have time-stamped originals for everything," he said finally. "Everything. External auditors on record naming you as the architect. Written report. Addressed to me personally." He took his glasses off his head, looked at them, put them back. "Ryan, what they've done here is straightforward IP misappropriation under federal statute. The financial redirection, depending on what the full documentation actually shows, could be wire fraud, bank fraud, potentially. This isn't a civil dispute. This is potentially criminal conduct. I know. Are you sure you want to move on this?" I looked at him. "They have 4 days to lock me permanently out of 11 years of my own work. Derek Walsh has my career and my wife. If I don't move now, there is no later. I will be filing for divorce regardless. I am asking you whether we can stop Tuesday." Connor nodded. One slow, deliberate nod. "We stop Tuesday. I need to file for an emergency temporary restraining order on the patent transfer. Today. I know Judge Harrington's clerk we can get a hearing Friday morning." He was already writing. "The financial piece goes to someone I trust, at the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, Agent Kim Reyes. She is exactly the right person for this. I'm going to call her today." I reached into my coat and placed the encrypted drive on his desk. He picked it up with both hands, the way you pick up something you understand the weight of. Held it for a moment. "You built all of this yourself," he said. Not a question. He was reading it. "From the ground up. That must have been something," he said quietly, "to watch get handed to someone else." I thought about the screen at the gala. The applause. Derek's posture. Architected by Derek Walsh. "Yeah," I said. "It was something." We sat for another hour after that, working through the specifics. Connor asked sharp, careful questions. He was mapping every possible line of counter-argument, every place Hale's legal team would try to find purchase. I answered everything exactly as it happened, without softening or expanding, just the facts in the order they occurred. There is a particular relief in telling a story to someone who is absorbing it correctly, not reassuring you, not minimizing, not asking you to consider the other side. Just listening with precision and building from what they hear. I left his office at 11:30 and sat on a bench outside for 10 minutes, face up to the cold gray sky. The city was loud around me, the usual weekday rush of people moving with their purposes, indifferent and warm and constant. I sat in the middle of all of it and let myself feel, briefly, what I'd been holding at clinical distance since that moment in the hallway 3 nights ago. Not rage. Rage was too hot and too fast for what this was. This was something more like grief. The ordinary grief of a man who has finally, completely let go of a version of his life that was never going to become what he needed it to be. The grief of abandoned effort, all those late nights, all those risks taken, all that silent swallowing of every moment he could have named what was happening and didn't. Not wasted effort, exactly. The work was real and provable. And I was about to prove it. But the context I'd built it inside the marriage, the family, the belief that the door would eventually open, that was gone. I let it be gone. I gave it about 10 minutes. Then I stood up and went to work. I did not go home. I checked into a business hotel near Connor's office Thursday night clean, anonymous, the kind of place that asks nothing of you and expects nothing in return. I set up my laptop on the small desk by the window, ordered room service I barely touched, and worked. Connor moved at speed. Emergency TRO application filed by 5 p.m. Thursday. Hearing confirmed Friday morning, 9 o'clock. I organized and cross-cataloged every piece of documentation with the meticulous precision of a man who has spent his entire career understanding that the record is the argument. Dates, timestamps, authorship, metadata, external correspondence, the auditor report, the commit logs, all of it ordered, all of it labeled, all of it coherent. I called my personal bank Friday morning and moved funds, separated accounts that had been jointly held, retrieved the collateral I'd put up during the breach response, the personal assets I'd pledged to hold certain vendor agreements in place while the company was in crisis, which had never been formally returned because nobody had gotten around to formalizing it. I had the paperwork. It had always been my paperwork. I got it back. On Saturday, I drove past the townhouse once. I didn't slow down. I looked at it through the driver's side window as I passed the Lincoln Park building with the high ceilings and the decorator choices on every surface, the home I'd lived in for 6 years. And I felt very little. The absence of feeling you find when you've already done the work of letting something go before you've officially let it go. The way a wound stops hurting once it's clean. On Sunday afternoon, I called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring. I could hear surprise in the way he said my name. Ryan. What's up? Just wanted to let you know I'll be in the office Monday morning, I said. My voice was pleasant, unhurried, completely ordinary, tying up some loose ends before the week gets busy. Sure, no problem. He was working to keep his tone equally ordinary and not quite succeeding. Appreciate it, I said, and hung up. What I needed was for him to tell Victor, and then I needed Victor to carry the comfort of that information into the weekend and arrive at Monday morning still certain that Ryan Cole was processing things internally and would, as he always did, accept them. I needed them to feel, for 48 more hours, that everything was under control. Monday I went to the office, smiled at Phil, made coffee, sat at my workstation, looked like a man at work. At 5:30, I left. At 9 p.m., Connor called. The hearing is set. Judge Harrington has found sufficient basis on the emergency application. Friday, 9 a.m. The restraining order holds pending the hearing. Tuesday's filing doesn't go through. Not a chance. I sat in the hotel room with the city lights outside the window and breathed. There's more, Connor said. Kim Reyes has reviewed the financial documentation. She's opening a preliminary inquiry. She said, and I'm quoting her, that the routing structure is, quote, not subtle. Something in my chest that had been held very tight for a very long time eased slightly. Just slightly. Friday morning, I said. Friday morning, Connor confirmed. I hung up and sat at the window for a while. Watched the city. Chicago moving at its late-night speed, indifferent and constant, and exactly what it had always been. And I thought about Thursday night 2 weeks ago, standing outside that ballroom with a laminated guest badge around my neck and the full weight of what I'd been refusing to see pressing down on every surface of me. I thought about what was waiting on the other side of Friday. Then I turned off the light and lay down in the hotel bed and, for the first time in a very long time, slept completely through the night. Wednesday morning, I put on my best suit, the charcoal one, the one I kept for moments when I needed my exterior to signal something my interior was already certain of. Good shoes, no tie. I drove to Hale Systems with the particular composure of a man who has made his decision and is now simply executing it. The board meeting was at 10. I was not on the agenda. I had never been on the agenda. The agenda was for people who were inside the frame. Victor was already seated at the head of the conference table when I came through the door, reading glasses on, coffee positioned, the arrangement of a man fully at ease in his own authority. Marcus to his right, the familiar configuration. 3 board members I recognized. Sandra Oy, the company's general counsel, who had a good legal mind and had never, I suspected, been entirely comfortable with the arrangement I'd always sensed. Something careful and watchful in her. When she was around me, the look of someone cataloging information they don't yet know the relevance of. Derek was there. He saw me come through the door, and his face did something fast and mostly hidden. A very rapid calculation running behind his eyes. I sat down at the table without waiting for an invitation. Ryan. Victor's voice was positioned carefully. This is a board session. I know, I said. I need 20 minutes. Then I'll be out of your way. Marcus. This isn't the time. I have documentation, I said. And the room went quiet, with the specific quiet that comes when someone in the room is speaking with the certainty of a man who is not performing certainty, but actually has it. Documentation pertaining to IP misappropriation, fraudulent patent amendment filings, and financial redirection of federal contract revenue through an entity that I believe this board is unaware of. I said it the way I'd practiced it, clearly, evenly, the way you state facts. I've filed for an emergency restraining order on the patent transfer scheduled for today. A hearing is set for this Friday in Judge Harrington's court. I have also provided documentation to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, who have opened a preliminary inquiry. The word Times. FBI, Times, landed in the room the way those words always land. It changed the temperature. Sandra Oy's pen stopped on her notepad and didn't move. Arthur Brent, the board member I'd always found most straightforward, leaned slowly forward with an expression that was not surprise so much as the rapid readjustment of a man who is recalibrating what he thought he knew about a situation. I placed a bound summary on the table. Connor had prepared it the night before, clean and precise, the kind of document that states its case without editorializing, and slid copies around to each board member. Kept my movements measured, unhurried. I'm not here for a confrontation, I said. I'm here because this board deserves to know what is currently happening in terms of legal and regulatory process before they read it somewhere else. I looked around the table. I thought that was the right thing to do. I stood. I looked at Victor. I looked at Marcus. I looked at Derek. Derek was looking at the table. I held Victor's gaze for a long second. Long enough for both of us to understand, completely and without ambiguity, that the arrangement we had operated under for 11 years was over. That the version of Ryan Cole who processed things internally and accepted what was put in front of him had left the building some days ago and was not coming back. Then I turned, walked to the conference room door at a measured pace, and let it close behind me with a quiet, final click. Outside, Chicago was gray and cold and smelled of the lake. I walked 3 blocks before I stopped, pressed my back against the stone face of a building, and for the first time in a week, let myself fully exhale. It was out of my hands now. Everything I'd built over the past 5 days was in motion, moving under its own weight. The filing, the inquiry, the documentation, the restraining order. All of it proceeding now with the implacable momentum of legal process, which does not care about family dynamics or company reputation or how things appear from the outside. I stood on that sidewalk in the cold Chicago morning, and I felt, beneath the exhaustion and the strange, flat calm of having done what needed doing, something close to release. Then I walked back to my car and drove to the hotel to wait for Friday. The hearing took 4 hours. Connor was precise and methodical, in exactly the way I'd hoped he would be. He walked Judge Harrington through the documentation with the patience of a man who has built his argument from the ground up and knows every inch of it. The time-stamped originals, the commit history, the external auditor's written report naming me as the architect, the email threads, the whiteboard photographs, the complete evidentiary trail of a man who had been meticulous about his record because he believed that good work should be provable. Hale's legal team, expensive lawyers, thorough, well-prepared, argued that I had been engaged on terms that made any IP created in the course of the work the company's property. It was a reasonable argument. Connor demolished it with the original consulting agreement from 11 years ago, the one that had preserved my authorship rights in specific language that I'd negotiated at 25 because even then, I'd understood that what I built was mine, and that this needed to be on paper. Nobody had thought to challenge that agreement. Nobody had thought they'd need to. The restraining order was made permanent, pending full adjudication. The patent transfer to Hale IP Holdings LLC did not go through on Tuesday. It did not go through on any day. Kim Reyes was efficient and thorough in the manner of a federal agent who has seen this pattern before and finds it neither surprising nor acceptable. The preliminary inquiry became a formal investigation in 10 days. The documentation I'd provided, combined with materials surfaced during the subsequent discovery process, revealed a financial misappropriation structure that extended significantly beyond what I'd found in those late-night hours in the server room. Revenue from 3 federal contracts improperly redirected. Falsified expense documentation used to classify personal transfers as company costs. A parallel consulting entity created specifically to extract IP licensing revenue while accounting for it as operational overhead on the official books. Victor Hale was placed under federal investigation 4 weeks after the board meeting. His attorney released a brief statement. Victor did not appear publicly. Marcus retained separate counsel and issued no statement at all. He had understood the moment I walked into that conference room that the conversation was over. Derek Walsh, whose name was on the patents, was named as a co-respondent in the civil IP suit. The title of Chief Innovation Officer became, with considerable speed, not an asset, but a liability. I was told by someone who still had visibility into Hale's internal conversations that he resigned within 2 weeks of the federal investigation going public, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities. It was the kind of language that sits in a file and waits. Diane called me 14 times between Wednesday and the following Tuesday. I didn't answer. She emailed twice the second one with a subject line, a single word that I saw in the preview before I moved it to archive. I filed for divorce through my attorney on the Thursday of the following week. I wanted nothing from the marriage that wasn't mine by law and by right. I wanted out clean. The townhouse was sold. I watched that transaction happen through my lawyer's communications, kept at a distance I deliberately created and found comfortable. Diane moved to River North. I didn't track the details past that, not because I was angry, because she was no longer in the part of the story I was living. The Chicago Tribune ran a data-driven piece on misappropriated IP in the city's tech sector, using Hale as its primary case study on a Thursday morning 3 weeks after the investigation became public. The reporter had done careful sourced work. My name appeared in paragraph 4. Ryan Cole, the original architect of the SHIELDWALL system, whose documentation formed the basis of the ongoing IP litigation. I read that paragraph twice. I'd been architecture for 11 years. I'd been in paragraph 4 all along. I just hadn't been in the right paragraph. The piece generated a volume of response I hadn't anticipated. Industry people who had known me professionally, people I'd built relationships with over the years of doing the kind of work that doesn't get announced but gets remembered by the people who needed it done, reached out over the following 2 weeks. Some of them were lawyers. Some were executives. Some were just people who knew the industry well enough to understand what had happened and wanted to say so. Not all of them said it sympathetically. Some were measuring me, professionally, the way people measure someone they're considering, bringing into an orbit, but they all said it directly. I answered every message. I kept my responses professional and factual. I did not editorialize about Victor or Marcus or Derek. I did not ask for sympathy. I said what had happened, what was being resolved through proper legal channels, and what I was building now. The calls that followed were real ones. People who wanted to work together. People who had watched the Hale situation with the recognition of industry veterans who had seen good architects sidelined before and understood what it meant when one of them finally stood up inside the system instead of walking away, quietly. They wanted to know what I was building. They wanted to be part of it. A few of them wanted to invest. I didn't take the investment. Not yet. I wanted to build something that understood its own weight before it had outside money, telling it what it should become. What I took instead was time. I took the fact that the phone was ringing, and I was answering it on my own terms. I took the first morning I walked into Ironframe and found the team already there, already at work, already deep in something without anyone having to unlock a door or start a machine or get things going. The self-sustaining forward motion of a team that gives a damn. That first morning I stood in the doorway for a moment. Before I walked in, just to let myself register it, to let it be exactly what it was. A letter arrived at the Ironframe office in December, routed through my lawyer, from Diane. No return address on the envelope. Short, the length of someone who has chosen their words carefully. She wrote that she hadn't realized fully how far it had gone, that the pressure of her family's expectations had made her into a version of herself she didn't recognize, that she hoped I was well, that she was sorry. I read the whole letter. Then I folded it, put it in a drawer, and went back to the proposal I'd been working on before the mail arrived. Not because the apology didn't mean anything, not because I thought she was lying, but because sorry, even genuine, carefully chosen sorry doesn't rebuild what was dismantled. It's acknowledgement, not repair. And I had moved past the place where I needed acknowledgement from anyone who had been part of what happened. I had moved past it entirely. I leased space in the West Loop in February. Second floor of a converted warehouse, brick walls, the heavy timber bones of a building that had been useful for 100 years and intended to stay that way. Not flashy, not designed to announce itself, just solid, well built, with good light in the morning, and enough space to become exactly what you needed it to be. I called it Ironframe. The name didn't come from a calculated branding exercise. It came from the idea I kept returning to, through everything that had happened, about what actually holds. Not the decorative elements, not the facade, the internal structure, the part that nobody sees, that was never meant to be seen, that exists entirely to bear weight. The part that stands when everything else is failing. I hired 5 people in the first month. Priya Nair, lead engineer, the most technically gifted person I'd worked alongside in my entire career, who had been systematically underused at her previous firm, because she was also the most direct person in any room, and directness made the wrong kind of people uncomfortable. She'd been ready to leave the industry before I called her. Luis Mendoza, project manager. He ran timelines the way a conductor runs a symphony, with total awareness of every instrument and no visible effort. He was also constitutionally incapable of telling you something was fine when it wasn't, which was the trait I valued most. 2 senior analysts and a business development lead who had each, independently, reached out to me after the Tribune piece ran. People who knew the industry, who had watched what had happened with a recognition that told me they'd seen versions of it before, who wanted to be part of something being built correctly from the start. Nobody from Hale. Nobody with an obligation to anything that had already happened. Clean room, clean slate. The first client came through Connor, a referral from one of his corporate clients who needed a security audit and had heard my name. I delivered the audit in 2 weeks instead of the 4 I'd quoted, found 3 critical vulnerabilities they hadn't known existed, and had all 3 remediated within 30 days of engagement. They signed a 12-month retainer before the remediations were complete. 2 more clients by spring. In April, a procurement officer from a federal contracting office I'd previously worked with through Hale called my direct line. I hadn't reached out to her. She called me. "We heard what happened," she said, with the directness of a federal officer who doesn't see the point of evasion. "We also heard what you built." A pause. "We have a contract cycle opening in 60 days. We'd like you to submit a proposal." We submitted a proposal. 6 weeks later, we won the contract. I took the whole team to dinner. At a place in the West Loop, not expensive, not performative, just good food and a table that fit all of us. And I looked around at these 6 people and felt something it took me a moment to identify correctly. Pride. Not the kind where you're proving something to someone who doubted you. Not the kind that needs an audience. Just the kind that belongs to you entirely, clean and uncomplicated, the pride of a man sitting inside something he actually built. Victor Hale entered a plea agreement in October. Federal charges related to financial fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Fines. Disgorgement of improperly obtained funds. And a 5-year bar from serving as an officer or director of any public company. No prison time, which disappointed some people who followed the case. But for Victor Hale, irrelevance was a more precise consequence than prison. He had spent 40 years building himself into a man of consequence. The agreement reduced him to a private citizen with a federal record and a story people in this city told when they wanted an example. Marcus settled separately. Lesser charges. Fines. He retreated into silence, which surprised me, since I'd always thought silence was constitutionally incompatible with who he was. The IP suit settled out of court in November. Iron Frame received a licensing payment I won't specify, and a formal written acknowledgement that the SHIELDWALL architecture had been conceived, designed, and architected by me. The acknowledgement was the thing I cared about. The document existed now. The record was correct. Connor called when the settlement was filed. "You did it clean, Ryan. Every step of it clean." "I had to," I said, because they weren't. A letter arrived at the Iron Frame office in December. Raudu, Hupard, Lee. R. Tour. R. Tour. Twar. R. Tour. Tour. R. Short. The length of someone who has chosen their words carefully. She wrote that she hadn't realized fully how far it had gone. That the pressure of her family's expectations had made her into a version of herself she didn't recognize. That she hoped I was well. That she was sorry. I read the whole letter. Then I folded it, put it in a drawer, and went back to the proposal I'd been working on before the mail arrived. Not because the apology didn't mean anything. Not because I thought she was lying. But because sorry, even genuine, carefully chosen sorry, doesn't rebuild what was dismantled. It's acknowledgement, not repair. And I had moved past the place where I needed acknowledgement from anyone who had been part of what happened. I had moved past it entirely. There's a morning in early December I keep coming back to, 6 a.m. The city still in its deep winter dark. That particular Chicago darkness that has mass to it, that presses against the windows with physical intention. I was at my desk early, coffee still hot, working through a proposal for a new engagement while the rest of the team wasn't in yet. The building was quiet, except for the muffled sound of the city running itself below. I looked up and caught my reflection in the dark glass of the window. I looked like myself, not erased, not the deep-boned tired that had been looking back at me from mirrors for years. Not the version of Ryan Cole who processed everything internally, because the cost of showing it was one more thing he couldn't afford to spend. I looked like a man sitting at his own desk, doing his own work, in a space that existed because he had decided it should. I looked present. I looked real. I held that for a while. Just let it be true. I thought about the gala. The laminated badge. Guest. That had been a Thursday night in October. 11 weeks ago. 44 years of building a life. 11 of them. Inside someone else's frame. And 11 weeks to start standing inside my own. There's a particular damage that happens to people who are used the way I was used. It's not dramatic damage. It's not the kind that announces itself. What gets taken from you, slowly and deliberately, is your sense of your own scale. Your sense of how large you actually are, of what you're actually capable of what the world looks like when you're standing in the center of it, rather than at its margin. Someone who has been told their time's helping out times long enough, consistently enough, begins to orient their life around helping out. Begins to build their identity around being useful to a structure they're not permitted to own. What I understand now, in a way I couldn't have understood without going all the way through it, is that the frame was never real. It was performance. Victor's performance of consequence. Marcus's performance of authority. Diane's performance of belonging to something larger than herself. Derek's performance of excellence. All of it built on a foundation that was mine. My architecture, my work, my late nights, my risk, and all of it designed, deliberately or not, to keep me unable to see clearly enough to walk away. When I stopped performing the role they'd assigned me, capable, quiet, accepting, necessary, but never named, the whole structure showed what it had always been. It had no weight of its own to bear. Take my work out of the equation, and what Victor had was a mid-sized regional company with good connections and compromised internal controls. Take my work out of the equation, and Derek Walsh was an integration engineer with a good haircut. Take my work out of the equation, and the empire they'd raised their glasses to at every dinner, every gala, every celebration of their own collective greatness was hollow air, dressed up as architecture. They thought the frame was load-bearing. It was cosmetic. The load had always been mine. I don't say this with anger. The anger, to the degree I ever had it, burned off quickly. What replaced it was simpler and more durable clarity. The particular clarity of a man who knows, now, exactly what he's made of and exactly what he's worth. Not because someone confirmed it for him, but because he built the proof himself. I had always built the proof myself. I'd just been leaving it with the wrong people. There are things I kept from those 11 years. I kept the skills I'd built under hostile conditions, which are stronger for the resistance. You learn more about how systems fail when you're under real pressure than you ever do in a controlled environment. I kept the knowledge of what genuine loyalty looks like, because I've seen the counterfeit in such detail that I could describe it in a court document and did. I kept the ability to read a person and a situation with the accuracy of someone who has learned, at considerable personal cost, not to let himself see only what he wants to see. I kept something else, something smaller and more important. The knowledge of what I'm capable of when I stop performing smallness for people who need me small. When I stop organizing my life around the comfort of people who are made uncomfortable by my actual size. When I stop walking quietly around the edges of rooms I built. By spring, Iron Frame had 12 people and 2 federal contracts, and the kind of reputation that had not been purchased or performed but earned, the slow and genuine way, by doing the work correctly and letting the work be the argument. We turned down 2 acquisition approaches. I attended an industry conference where 3 separate people approached me in the first hour, and I could tell, from the quality of their attention, that they were talking to someone they expected to still be here in 10 years. We are going to be here in 10 years. Connor came by in March to see the office. He stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, looking at the room the boards covered in my team's work. The organized, productive energy of people who give a damn, the afternoon light coming through the big windows and making everything warm and specific and real. He looked at it the way you look at something that confirms something you suspected. Then he walked in and sat down across from me and said, "You know what's funny? 6 months ago, you had nothing except what you'd made. And now, you have nothing except what you've made." I laughed. It was the clearest thing anyone had said to me in years. I thought about Victor's speeches at all those dinners, about legacy and vision and building something that lasts. He'd been right about the concept. I'll give him that. He just hadn't understood where it actually lived. Legacy isn't in the name on the door. It's not in the portrait on the wall, or the plaque at the gala, or the toast at the celebration dinner. It's in the thing itself. It's in whether the thing stands when you're not performing it. Whether the work is real enough to hold weight under pressure. Whether what you built is actually what you say it is, or whether it's just the story you told about it. The Hale Systems story was a story. A very good one, maintained over decades with considerable skill. The story needed me because the story needed someone to actually do the underlying work. But the story was not interested in the underlying work having a name. The story needed the work invisible. The moment it became visible, the moment I walked into that conference room and put documentation on that table, the story ended and the reality began. And the reality was much smaller than the story. The iron frame story is different. The iron frame story is boring from the outside. It's 12 people doing technically demanding work very well, iterating, learning, delivering. There are no galas. There are no banners. There is a whiteboard in the main conference room covered in my team's handwriting, and it changes every week because the work changes every week, and the team is engaged enough with the work to want to keep thinking about it even after the day ends. That whiteboard. That's the whole thing. That's what I was building toward. Even when I didn't know I was building toward anything. Outside the windows, Chicago was running at its regular speed. The lake somewhere beyond the rooftops, doing what it always did, constant and vast and completely indifferent to human arrangements. The city below moving with the particular kind of relentlessness that says, things end, and then other things begin, and the city doesn't slow for either. I had a 3 o'clock. A team waiting for design review feedback they'd sent me at 7 in the morning because they came in early and cared about getting it right, not because someone was watching them. I had work that was mine, not helping out, not absorbing someone else's discomfort, not proving myself to people who had already decided the proof didn't count, not standing outside a frame I'd built, looking in, mine. The only thing I'd ever lost in that situation was the illusion that I needed their permission to be exactly who I was. That the door to my own life was something someone else controlled. They forgot to keep me from seeing the door. And when I finally saw it clearly enough to walk through it, I walked through it, and I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, because I was done. And because on the other side of that door, on the other side of all of it, the gala and the overheard conversation and the midnight drive and the long, cold, careful work of reclaiming what was mine on the other side of all of it was this. My name on the door, my work on the boards, my people around the table. Proof, final and irrefutable, built not from what anyone had ever said about me, but from what I had stood up and done, in the clear, cold light of a thing that had finally, completely become mine.